Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks for a special edition of the weekend show. I'm Yin Khvat. We're honoured to be joined today by our special guest, Sir Robin Niblett. He's a distinguished fellow and former director and chief executive of Chatham House for 15 years, from 2007 to 2022, and author of The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the U.S. and China Will Shape Our Century. Sir Robin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
There was concern among Taiwan watchers already, but after Donald Trump's ceasefire deal with the Houthis, which excludes attacks on Israel's vessels, there have been increasing concerns Trump may so-called sell out Taiwan. Others say the US knows, how much is at stake for US power in Asia and globally. Are they right?
Donald Trump, if we go back to basics, is somebody who's avowedly open to the idea of spheres of influence. Certainly his opening attitude to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, his comments about Canada, Panama, Greenland, definitely echo those of somebody who believes that big powers need to look after their security in their own zone first. So you could imagine, he hasn't said it, but you could imagine that his view about Taiwan might be a little bit like his view about Ukraine. Well, if the Russians are going to fight for it, and if they can get it, is it worth the American effort to try and push them back? I'm not sure. The fact that the Ukrainians have been able to defend themselves and therefore have kept themselves in the debate with Trump and made it costly potentially for him to abandon Ukraine is an important part of his relationship with Russia. So if you move to China and Taiwan, I think a lot of the future is up to Taiwan, and Taiwan showing to the Trump administration that it's willing to take its protection of its democracy seriously. That buys, as with any country, same goes for all of Europe, buys you the clout within the Trump White House and the Trump mind and the MAGA mind that you're somebody worth treating seriously. So I think the first point to say is that Donald Trump is not somebody who will automatically be a supporter of Taiwan because it's a democracy, and a democracy that needs to be protected for that reason. However, Donald Trump is also somebody who's got to work out how many battles can he fight at one time. And the US Congress, although very quiet right now, is very supportive of Taiwan, both historically, the Taiwan Relations Act, the Taiwan Policy Act. These are all congressional efforts done to limit the power of the presidency to do deals with China directly. And I think those around Donald Trump are wise enough as well that if he were to make some compromise at the moment that really put Taiwan's security at risk, that would be a thing to add on to an already incredibly complex agenda. He's got negotiations with Iran, negotiations with Russia, negotiations with China on trade. He just doesn't need another complexity. So my sense is that Taiwan has time, and time to try to write its own agenda vis-a-vis Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump will then weigh up whether Taiwan is worth continuing for him to protect.
So on that subject of time, amid this uncertainty over Trump's stance, The Economist and some other international media have articles expressing the belief that Xi Jinping may conclude he should strike Taiwan while the iron is hot. Amidst this uncertainty over Trump, the impact this has had on regional partners, a little bit in disarray because of the upending of US foreign policy, and also while Taiwan itself is paralyzed in its parliament by an opposition majority, holding the majority. Now, your book is about a new Cold War. Are there any signals that it may be turning hot?
To give you a straight answer, I would say not. If China looks historically at what Russia and previously the Soviet Union has done in terms of conflicts, whether in Afghanistan, in the Soviet case of 1979, or Vladimir Putin's, certainly his full-scale invasion against Ukraine of 2022, these don't offer good templates or models for achieving results that you thought they were going to be.
But the results of that war have not yet concluded.
Absolutely. But the results of that war are that NATO has enlarged, that Ukraine has been able to exert and inflict on Russia very large casualties and very large damage to its military capability of a sort that a one-man, one-party state like Russia can probably get away with. But I think a very large 1.4 billion China, even with a leader like Xi Jinping, would draw breath about. Now, admittedly, the sanctions have not had a huge impact, certainly on Russia's decision to continue the war, and it's only had a minimal impact on its economy. But Russia is not a country that relies on global markets for its survival. And even if you were to get a proportion of other countries joining in on sanctions against China, if it were to carry out a military operation, you could say America's already done it with its 145% tariffs. But if you were to get Europe or Japan or South Korea joining in on some type of economic sanctions, I think that would be something for China to think about. The more important point, though, is that why? Why do that when you can't be certain yet whether China has the military capability, when there are still purges going on constantly of Chinese senior military leaders, and when in essence the gray zone war that China has continued to escalate from Nancy Pelosi's first visit through into the beginning of the Trump administration, more air incursions, more naval exercises, starting to announce them at the last minute, not by maritime agencies, but by admirals in the fleet. What I think China is already doing, and knows that Trump will not cause trouble about, is the boiling, the water around the frog, if you see what I'm saying, of Taiwan. And so I think China has space to keep increasing pressure around Taiwan and knows that Trump will not react to that. And America and the world will not react to that. Whereas if it were to do something that was hot, then there could be a reaction. So I think from the Beijing perspective, the plan continues, which is to keep bringing pressure on Taiwan and try to get Taiwan to change direction of its own volition.
You said in contrast to Cuba, where physical nuclear missiles were aimed at the US, that Taiwan, I'm quoting you, is an island that is almost like aiming the missile of democracy at the Communist Party. They cannot allow Taiwan to succeed indefinitely. And I wanted to ask you then, because Taiwan's very existence is then a provocation to the CCP, does this do away with the debate over provocations, this idea of that we cannot do things to provoke China, that certain things are warmongering, even just raising the threat of China, of trying to prepare for this threat. So does that all become meaningless if that is the case?
It's to do with time. In the near term, so long as the Communist Party of China believes it has an opportunity to draw Taiwan, as they would say, back to the mainland, then there has to be a consideration that certain types of military investment, or certainly the sale by America of certain types of military capabilities to Taiwan, could be seen in China as limiting its capacity to use military force should Taiwan declare independence. I mean, this is the ultimate threat that I think the Communist Party sees against itself, that Taiwan were to declare independence, that China has been explicit that it would then treat that as a military provocation for a military response, and China wants the capacity to be able to do a military response that would be successful. So in the near term, where Taiwan is still trying to do gray zone operations, a sense that they might be losing military advantage could potentially trigger it. Now, there are many things Taiwan can do to increase its military defensive capability that could stay on this side of that debate. So I believe Taiwan can and should continue to be able to make sure it's capable of defending itself, while the bigger question that you alluded to remains unresolved. So to your bigger question, which I noted in my book, that in a way Taiwan's very existence as a democracy is a provocation to the Communist Party of China, the only way that can be resolved would be for the Communist Party of China to not see it as a provocation. And right now, I'd say under the current leadership, it is a provocation. And it's hard for me to see in a 10-year time horizon a resolution to this problem. But if we're looking through to 2049, which is the ultimate time horizon, let's bring 5 years at least back to that, 2045, maybe. It is not inconceivable if Taiwan's democracy continues to be strong. You alluded to yourself, it's quite a debated, it's got some very strong debates at the moment, but strong debates are often a sign of a strong democracy. If Taiwan can survive as a democracy and even become stronger as a democracy, if Taiwan can make sure that it has the capacity to at least defend itself effectively, I think the challenge needs to be presented to the Communist Party of China. What do we do? Rather than the other way around. Yeah? But ultimately, the Taiwanese people, my sense is, are going to want to ensure that their democracy survives. It should not be impossible for a Communist Party-led China to find a way for that to be possible as well in the future, though I doubt the current leadership would accept it.
And so what would the vision for that be, that model?
That is a very difficult question to answer. The view for that would be, if we are talking about a one China with two systems, it would be literally what it says on the tin. I would have thought that where that might be most difficult would be around foreign policy and security policy, because in the end, China's fear about Taiwan's survival is double level. It is the threat to the Communist Party of China, as I wrote in my book, but a Communist Party that feels it has managed to get China to its great rejuvenation of 2049 might not feel so threatened by a democratic Taiwan. So that's at one level. The other level is its anchor position in the first island chain. And the only way that China would feel comfortable with Taiwan still being two systems with one country approach would be if it was not feeling so insecure about the United States as a threat to its survival.
Moving back to Trump, in your view so far, has he increased or decreased deterrence against China in terms of Taiwan?
Yeah, no, I'm taking a moment to think about this.
Let me just add to that.
Yeah.
So you previously said something that I found very interesting. You said that when Trump is wrong, he's very often right, and when he's right, he's very often wrong. What did you mean?
He often analyzes the problem correctly, but his solutions often tend to be wrong. And also their execution often ends up being suboptimal, to put it mildly. Look at the North Korea effort and negotiation, which ended up leaving North Korea in the end in a stronger position than before, and how he approached Russia in his first term, which ended up giving Putin, I think, a sense that he would have an opportunity to do more in the future. But in the context of Taiwan, he's right, as he's been right about Europe. Are we spending enough on our own defense? Not only for America to be there militarily, but for America to be able to be supportive of us politically. You know, he is right in analyzing the mood in America is that we're paying too much for other people's defense. We don't mind defending other people, but we should be doing that together. But your question was more about deterrence. Has he weakened it as a result? In the end, my view is that if allies are able to be able to deter an external threat better by themselves, then they make themselves better allies potentially for America. But I think that if we look beyond the Trump presidency, if Taiwan comes out of this with a better capacity to defend itself, number one, but also a country that is building up relationships with other democracies and a little less reliant on America for its political support. And in particular, I think I'm seeing, and I'm happy to see, and I would encourage seeing, more of Taiwan teaming up with other liberal democracies that also feel they might have to survive without Trump. The G7 plus countries, whether it be Japan, South Korea, Britain, the European Union, Canada, these are countries that also have a stake in long-term protection of democracy, that are not entirely sure that America's deterrence is going to be there for them, and are trying to do something about strengthening themselves in the process. So I think America's deterrent capacity will be better if we are all, and I'm speaking as a European who knows Europe better than Taiwan, if we're stronger, then America will be a better ally. So in the long term, accidentally, although Trump is calling into question alliances, he seems to be supportive of spheres of influence, we might end up, if we take his threat seriously, better allies to a future president.
You said that Ukraine is a pawn in a bigger game for Trump, and that ending the war there could help him divide Russia from China. So how did you interpret Victory in Europe Day in Russia, where Xi Jinping was Vladimir Putin's special guest, you know, all the talk about an unbreakable friendship, was Trump's wooing of Putin in vain?
Well, I think, although, let me phrase what I think Trump is up to, which obviously is different to what Biden was up to. I don't think Trump is trying to do what people describe as a reverse Nixon. You know, he's not, I don't think he thinks strategically in those geopolitical foreign policy terms. If I, you know, do a peace deal with Ukraine, even if I have to a deal that's not good for Ukraine, I can then separate from Russia from China, and then we can focus on the China threat. I think he has a much more basic outlook, which is that by continuing the war with Ukraine and having to support it, we're forcing Russia and China together, which prevents America from being able to take advantage of business opportunities in China.
But if I may,
Yep.
there were several comments by members of his team, Steve Witkoff,
Yep.
Marco Rubio,
Yep.
precisely about that, which is that we must separate the two.
Honestly, in the end, the one thing I've learned about Donald Trump is I think one has to go by one's instincts about him and not by what people around him say. There are many, you mentioned those two, but you can go to something like Elbridge Colby, who's actually laid this out for many years in a very sort of clear way, and now Under Secretary of Defense for Policy. But in the end, as we've learned, people can think they have influence over what Trump's position is on foreign policy, but in the end, only he decides. And I would argue that business trumps foreign policy for Trump. And in the end, he sees Russia as a business opportunity and a sort of geo-economic opportunity, not as a geopolitical threat. And I don't think he even sees China as a geopolitical threat. He sees China as a geo-economic, or certainly an economic threat to the kind of America he wants to see, with jobs that are high manufacturing level operating in America and not operating in China. So I think, you know, I'm not going to be shaken from that view. And I've heard people like Graham Allison, the professor at Harvard who coined the Thucydides trap term, say that often you just need to look at what Trump has said to know what Trump really believes, but not listen to the people around him saying what they think he believes. So that would be my view on it. Of course, what it means then for the Russia-China relationship, and you look at the VE Day or their Victory Day that they celebrated in Moscow just recently, I think it's a reminder in my mind that the Russia-China relationship is unbreakable, at least so long as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are in power. In the end, both of them see America as an enemy that they need each other for. Vladimir Putin needs America as an enemy to survive in power in Russia. And if Ukraine survives, which I hope and believe it will as a sovereign state, even if it's got 20% less of its territory, then it will be, we will end up with, in essence, a new Iron Curtain down Europe, but a little further to the east. And Russia will not compromise with Europe, and Europe will not compromise with Russia, whatever Trump wants, which means it stays in China's hand. It needs China still as its protector and as its economic outlet. China needs Russia, whatever happens, because it's going to be facing America in a new Cold War for 20, 30, 40 years into the future. So I think any efforts to break that relationship are naive. And I think both the countries, and they said it themselves, believe there's a bigger future for them and their team in the Global South and in the Middle East and in Central Asia.
Those changes unseen in a century.
Absolutely. The line that Xi Jinping, I think, gave to Trump in one of his earlier meetings, and we are leading these changes. You know, it is, I mean, China needs Russia for that to be real. 2 Security Council members, 2, as the Chinese are very clever now of reminding us, 2 victors of the Second World War. It gives them a sort of legitimacy to take on this mantle as one of the alternative leaders to America. And then if America does a good job being an alternative pole, China can live with it. But if America fails at being an alternative pole, which Trump risks making a reality, then China comes out on top. So I think, if you're sitting in Beijing or Russia right now, it's all going according to plan.
A final question, Sir Robin. So Admiral Samuel Paparo, he's the Indo-Pacific commander, has spoken about how fear and pride are driving Beijing's actions. Do you agree with that? And is it also true for the US side? I mean, you have said that you don't believe that's true for Trump himself.
That's a very interesting point, because you correctly said what I would say. I'm not sure it's true for Trump himself, but I think America as a body politic and the Communist Party China as a political organization do fear each other. And fear then becomes the engine of a security dilemma, which means each side interprets steps that the other takes to make itself feel more secure, makes the other feel more insecure. And that's one of the principal arguments why I argue we are in a new Cold War between the United States and China. And that fear is not just geopolitical. Would it be fear if it's geopolitical? You think you can build up military capabilities against each other, and the two sides are, in a way, in an arms race and in a geopolitical race to either reinforce or weaken the first island chain that is a core part of that geopolitical contest. But it also goes into almost the ideological dimension, where Americans do not want to allow their peer competitor, the first peer competitor since 1940s, 30s, to be a one-party Communist Party state, because they believe that that type of a state is in itself one that is constantly insecure, because their belief is that one-party states might be stable for a while, but in the end, history shows us, they tend to end up becoming insecure, and then they externalize that insecurity to their neighborhood or to their opponents like America. And if you're in America, they'll even read TikTok, as a potential threat to America's political survival, because it's radicalizing or infantilizing young Americans to look at democracy through the wrong lens. So you have a real challenge there. And if you're on the Chinese side, it's also seen as an ideological risk, because the belief is that the Americans won't allow the Communist Party to be safe running China. And they're right. So obviously China then spends all its time trying to defend itself against America and American encroachment, the spread of democracy. And of course that puts Taiwan, back to where we started this conversation, right in the middle of the frame. So yeah, I'm afraid I think each side believes that the other side's capabilities mean intentions. I think part of our job in the non-profit world is always to try to make sure that we understand the difference between intentions and capabilities, and try to work towards peaceful outcomes in the long term, but peaceful outcomes that protect democracy.
Sorry, I do want to ask a final question on that difference between intentions and capabilities. But however, as you had pointed out, Taiwan's very own existence is a provocation. So this would seem to say that it is only a matter of time that the CCP would attempt to take Taiwan. So that would seem to say that it's a clear intention, not just capability.
Look, I cannot see into the future. What I believe is what I've said, which is that Taiwan's existence as a democracy is a provocation, certainly to Xi Jinping's version of China and the Communist Party. I don't know how China might evolve in the future. As I said, I hope that Taiwan continues to be a flourishing democracy, in which case what I'll be watching very carefully, as long as my health remains with me, is how China continues to evolve, and whether a future Communist Party, as it continues to evolve itself, which it has done in its own history, can live alongside a China that is more diverse than the China that Xi Jinping seems to be comfortable with. So if Taiwan doesn't change, this is going to come to a head at some point. Taiwan needs to make sure that it can be as robust and resilient as possible as a whole of society concept. And it needs to have allies around it that will make China think about the kind of future they want to have with Taiwan. And then I'm hopeful that China itself will evolve and be less insecure. But that requires the Communist Party itself to think differently about itself within China's future. And that's another chapter for another book.
Sir Robin, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today.